Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here with you. And first of all, I've been asked to share a little bit of my story because we all have stories. This is a young man that has brought us into the arena of autism. This young man's name is Madison. When I was pregnant with Madison, I had the same thing as I had with my other pregnancies, and I had morning sickness during the time, and I would have to go to the blender to try to make something that I could palate. And when I was expecting with Madison, I would go to the blender, and I would go to turn it on, and I would know the reaction that I had had with my other pregnancies. So I would put one hand on my tummy, I would turn to the blender, I would put my finger out, and I would be braced for the infant to start kicking. But with Madison, it didn't happen. He remained very calm, even though there was a motor close to his ear. When Madison was born, he was born into a family with two parents, two siblings, and a grandmother who was 80 years of age living in the same house, who was in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's. At age 3 weeks, Madison was in my mother's apartment with me, and there was a slamming of a door. And usually with infants, they will track to a sharp sound. There was no response. I started ringing bells, clapping by his ear, no tracking. After an evoked brainstem hearing test, the person turned to us and said, "Yes, Madison can hear, but he's just electing to ignore you. Take him home and he's going to be just fine." Little did we realize that we had some of the first indications of autism. Madison didn't talk for a very long period of time. He was about 4 when he started putting some things together, maybe a little bit at 3. And when we approached some of the people that were part of our atmosphere, see, my husband is a research scientist and has been working with pediatric diseases, specifically RSV. And as a result of that, we had pediatricians coming out of the woodwork. They would see young Madison running around, but not saying anything. None of them picked up on it, none of the indicators. They just said, "Well, you know, Einstein didn't talk for a long time either. He's going to be just fine." On Christmas Eve, when Madison was 3, my best friend and her sister were at our home, and on Christmas Eve, her sister, who was in special education in Texas, watched Madison closely. And on the way out, my friend turned and whispered in my ear and said, "My sister's been watching Madison, and she thinks something is wrong, and you should have him checked out." It played into many of our suspicions, but I had wished so much that she would have waited at least a day, that we could have had the news just after Christmas. Christmas Eve was the longest night of my entire life, knowing that there may be something or some name to be put on what we were noticing with Madison as he was running around on tippy toes, not speaking, and loving to twirl things. When Madison was 3, I took him into a shop at Christmas time, and I wanted to get some lights in the back of the store. He happened to have seen balloons on the way in. I guess he was about 4 at this time. He saw balloons at the beginning of the store, but I wanted lights. I took him back where the lights were. He was in the cart. I was pushing. I was in control. Madison stands up in the cart as I'm going through the white, red, green, blue lights, puts his hands on his hips and says, "Damn it, balloons." Now, I don't know where he got the language, but I started to cry and tears came down my cheeks. And the woman next to me looked at me like she was totally appalled. "You've got a young child here and he's swearing." And I'm saying, "Yes!" And it was a complete sentence. Madison grew, and his passions became bubbles, for one thing. And we would look at Madison and wonder, you know, is there a profession where this would be marketable? Is this an employment possibility? But often he would fill our front yard with millions of bubbles, especially on a damp morning in Maryland. But when we received a diagnosis after we had taken him into the doctors, we received the diagnosis of PDD, NOS, pervasive developmental delay, otherwise not specified. Little did I realize that that was a moniker for autism. He started school and went on a school bus at age 3. I would see my little tiny guy on a great big bus, and he started his educational plan. Many things went very well for Madison, and he grew. And he's a very handsome guy. And as one sidelight too, when Madison was born, 24 hours different on the other side of the country, we're in Washington, D.C., his cousin was born. His cousin is currently the quarterback for UCLA. 2 different futures, same family within 24 hours. The school system was good for Madison until he hit one teacher that had no idea in her special education background of how to deal with autism. She called security on him when they were walking around a track one evening. And she didn't give him the opportunity to transition. They were enjoying it. It was after school. It was a pretty fall afternoon. She gets to the gate and says, "Madison, we're going in now," rather than giving him a few moments warning and saying, "Madison, when we get up here a little ways, we're going to go into the school. It's the end of the day." When he wasn't compliant, she called security. 2 large guys coming, taking him by the arms, and forcing him into school. This was the beginning of a disastrous year that became the perfect storm. That and possibly 80 or 90 other major things happened with his educational process, to the point that one day he was brought home from school, was up in his room, and when we went to check on him after we thought he'd calmed down, he had pulled out hair on his head and a patch about this big. We had a very difficult year, and Madison is finally back on track and doing some incredible things. Along the way, Madison, though, has opened the door for us to meet many interesting people, including this lady who became a very dear friend. You'll recognize her, Eunice Shriver. She became a tremendous example to parents and families of how to step forward and work on behalf of our loved ones with intellectual disabilities. And she would talk to him and lecture him about JFK and being in the White House. Madison had no idea what it meant, but he loved her attention. This is Madison. Because of him, we thought we wanted to step into the arena of doing a school. But as we did a marketing survey, we found out that there was a huge area of need, and that happened to be the arena of those 21 and over dealing with autism. It was the area that Madison was heading for, and we decided that we would move forward in founding Madison House Foundation. We knew that what he was facing was also something that thousands of others on the spectrum would be facing. If you wanted to describe Madison so you have a little bit of a point of reference, I would say that he is moderately profoundly autistic, whatever that means with this whole range, but this will give you a little bit of an idea. Not terribly verbal, has wonderful preferences and a great sense of humor. We knew what our other children would be doing. They would graduate from college, get a job, perhaps fall in love, get married, have a family, retire, enjoy that, and age in the place that they cared for. That was not going to be Madison's future. But we knew that we wanted to provide choice because we saw little out there. This is our Mr. Cool. He's never going to have a totally independent life. But he summed up something for us one day when we were driving around. We were going to have a family event, and we were going to have a number of people coming, and we'd counted the noses of everybody in our family. And as we were driving around, my husband was doing a mental count and saying, okay, now who's coming? Okay, and there's Madison. And I said, no, Madison doesn't count. And in the back seat, we hear this little voice going, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Madison counts. And so does Madison. Madison does count, and so do our other children. And we, where we can be, and be advocates, especially for those who are not going to be able to advocate for themselves or in arenas that they may not understand, we do need to pull together, and that's what we're hoping to do with Madison House Foundation. There is something called the dreaded cliff by many parents when children reach the age of 21. And it varies from state to state and region to region as exactly what that means. We're not going to talk about transition, but we're going to talk about things that happen and where there are gaps, and the things that our adult children are going to need. We know that there are some adult services available, that they're not an entitlement, but they are dependent upon funding. And with those services being contingent on such a thing, we know that we're on shaky ground. Currently, schools will start to talk about transition at age 14 to 16, but we see that parents need to be aware much earlier than that. And I want to make you aware of the scope of things and then show you a lot of reasons for hope and a brighter future. Your child will grow up, and many of them will need services, and they're going to have to be planned for carefully. My point here is not to scare you, but maybe just enough so we can wake up and do something. But rather to say, with a little advanced planning, creative thinking, and by banding together, we can turn the dream of a bright future for your child and mine with autism into a reality. It's starting to be done in small portions around the country, and there are pockets of excellence, but we need to have it happening in every neighborhood across the country, and we can start now. We realized too, as we got in on this, that one of the areas that wasn't being talked about 4 years ago, though there's more conversation now, is housing. But in order to have successful housing, we need to have so many other supports pulled together at the same time. Educated professionals, such as first responders and ER staff, employers, an understanding community, continuing education for those working with our children and for our children, and new financial products that parents can participate in to hopefully relieve some of the public burden. I will touch on these things. When we realize that our children's education comes to an end at age 21, they still have a majority of their lives ahead of them. Parents have questions like, where will my child live? Will my child have a job? Who will provide the medical care? Will their education continue? Will they have any recreation in their lives? And what about retirement and respite care? And am I making the right financial decisions now? Here's part of the wake-up call. Here is a survey that the Easter Seals did. If you look at the green line, that shows the level of concern that parents with children without disabilities and the level of worry they have about their children's future. Look at the blue line. That's where we are. If you haven't started planning for the future, you're not alone. 62% of us have not. Only 12% have a life care plan in place. It may sound too overwhelming because we have to deal with things on a day-to-day basis. To project forward is challenging. But taken tiny bite-sized pieces over a few decades, your planning can result in a tremendous outcome for your children. With every 13 minutes, a child with autism being born, in a decade, or within 2 decades, they will all be coming into adulthood. And at the end of those same 2 decades, many adults with disabilities who have baby boomer parents will be losing their home and possibly their primary caregivers. Where will all of our children and loved ones, or where will all of our loved ones live, and who will care for them? Nearly 8 in 10 adults live with their parents or guardians currently, and many baby boomer parents begin to pass away. Where will these individuals be? In many states, it takes being in a severe crisis to be moved forward on waiting lists. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, the problem that is facing us as parents as we try to make a path for our children and who will care for them. I don't know if we can rely on our siblings. 64% of the parents in the Easter Seal study either didn't know or already knew that their other children would not care for their child with autism. Is it fair to assume that siblings who have already had to adapt their lives to coping with the immediate needs of a brother or sister on the spectrum as they have been growing up, and who have had to sacrifice a great deal to the family to cope with the daily demands made by autism, do we now expect these siblings to bring this adult with autism into their home or to provide daily management of their life needs? How will this affect a second generation of children? We all hope that our children will be engaged in the lives of one another by love and caring, but how much is too much? And can we count on public funding? What do you think? Yeah, with the conversations that have been going on recently, yeah. And we have currently limited financial products. There is nothing specifically for our population that is like a 529 plan, which means we can put monies aside without tax penalties for our children for particular portions of their life. It's been for education right now. But if your child is not going to go on to a college or university, we don't have a mechanism that is successful right now in moving forward. We need to encourage public-private partnerships, and we need to look toward formulating attitudes within insurance companies to be able to produce products that would be beneficial to us, to form a new paradigm. With a population of 730,000 school-aged children that are currently diagnosed with autism syndrome, or autism spectrum disorder, that there are a lot of others that are going to be needing services as well that don't come totally under our umbrella. And there's a huge need that is going to be out there with our population and with others. We see that within housing, there is a slim option, that there's basically right now the one house in the middle of a community with 1 or 2, perhaps 3 residents. We are in favor of that model, but we need a lot of other models because this may not remain financially viable. So we can get people off of long waiting lists, and in some states that may be upwards of 20 years. We need to look at what other options might be because one size does not fit all. If I was told I could only live in one type of housing, that would be limiting my options. Our children need to have choices too for things that best fit them. And within direct care staff, we have a 53% turnover with the caregivers that we have. That's a huge turnover, especially if we're not there and available to oversee things. And our communities need to come into play on this. I'm going to play this and then go on to one other thing. This reflects the lack of understanding within our communities. I hope. Is this playing now? The sound is not going still. All right, I'm going to move forward because of time issues. Yeah. I'll just move forward on this. This is a young man that was going to talk about the problems of a group home being placed into a community and all of the feedback that the community came together to say, it's not going to happen in my neighborhood. Did you know it was going to be less than a quarter of a mile from a school? How could we have this happening? On, and at the very end, you see censored come over his mouth because he's saying what he thinks about the situation in the community. He says it's being censored because he's using some very bad language to express his displeasure. But the point is that we do need to bring communities into our engagement so they understand what the situation is, so we can have employers stepping forward, so we can take our children to movies without having people complaining about the noise next to them. There is hope. Even though we may not be able to count on siblings and public funds, there are organizations like ours and others that are looking into some of the issues that are facing adults on the spectrum. There are corporations like Marriott and Target that are providing opportunities for employment. There are schools, but not enough of them, that are teaching people how to become caregivers. And hopefully we can make these promising professions so there isn't the turnover that has been available or that has happened in the past. And in the past, where the red is, we had institutions. We have swung very far over to the other side where there's only one particular type of an option. Perhaps we need to be someplace in the middle where we're looking at different types of options for housing, some that can be more affordable. There are organizations popping up trying to help with the waiting lists and with housing, helping with our savings plans. Right now, with what we're talking about, the options that are happening, people remaining at home or being in a licensed facility, living with family, renting an apartment, purchasing a home, shared housing, or some intentional communities, still kind of fits within that 1 or 2 or 3 in a model. There are some movements that are happening nationally, faith-based models, residential and work models, farm models, and the one, let's see, right down on the bottom there, is one that is kind of a transitional model, and it happens to be Brevard, where there is a living situation with guidance for a 2-year period, because perhaps with some of our children, they will not have one place to live in their life. They may be like all of the rest of us and be in a couple of different places as they grow and progress and things fit their needs. And then the faith-based situation too, and more faith communities are stepping forward to help embrace our population. But as we look toward housing, Madison House Foundation is targeting these issues. To make housing functional, we must have a solid and broad foundation. The good thing is we are seeing individuals and communities coming together to address the problems, and progress is at hand. And Madison House Foundation wants to shed light on groups that are doing good things and to form a network of pockets of excellence, where people can go and find out what is working in other communities and how they are solving the problems we have discussed. And in so doing, we can learn from one another, make fewer mistakes, and move the process ahead nationally at a faster rate and in a more unified fashion. And we're not advocating one model over another, we're just trying to advocate choice. And in so doing, we can create new funding sources, formulate more choices, have communities more educated on how to include our loved ones in more and meaningful ways. It will also increase avenues in which our adult children can contribute their talents back to their communities. It is overwhelming, but you can eliminate much anxiety by planning early. You can go on the internet, you can research, you can network with one another, form groups within your own communities. As individuals, be understanding, learn what you can, and don't be intimidated. As a group, we can come together within our communities to solve our questions locally and see what things we need to have excellent lives lived within our regions. And nationally, organizations like ours can move forward with helping to pave the way so legislation does not stand in the way of the things that need to be done, and that we can have the types of support in the public arena so we're not penalized, but we are encouraged to do the things that we can. Our last example here, in the past, others with disabilities had found an overwhelming obstacle in the curb. We still use this as an example because if we move forward with the things that I've been talking about, it's not only going to be our community that will benefit. As with the curb cut, it was made for those with wheelchairs and mobility problems to be able to access sidewalks in an easier fashion. But what has happened? Who is it helping? It's helping many of us. Even with some wonderfully unexpected consequences. I'm hoping that what we can do together can help our population and help society move forward, especially with dealing with the issues with autism. Thank you.